I'm Stan Altman, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at Baruch, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. This is a slightly bittersweet morning. This morning has several purposes, one of which was to announce the formation of the Archives on Municipal Finance and Leadership, which was, and still is, an idea that stemmed from, although my boss, Ned Regan, often says that it's my doing, it was an idea that got started 3 years ago when he, unbeknownst to me, was a candidate for the presidency at Baruch, and we were at an event that the school had organized, and he suggested that as chairman of MAC, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, there were all of these papers that were going to end up in a warehouse someday that he really thought had more value, that it had value to future scholars and people who were interested to learn about what an institution like MAC did and why it was created in the first place. And it was such a good idea that I thought that maybe the idea needed to be embellished a bit, and that other people must be collecting papers that happened in the city's fiscal crisis. And so I figured if anybody knew about stuff like that, it had to be Jack Beagle. And so I put in a call to Jack and said, what do you know about people who had papers from the city's fiscal crisis? And his answer was, how did you know I've been putting together a private collection for 35 years? And so that started a 3-year journey that led to this morning, to the announcement that the MAC papers are here, that they have already been converted to digital form. It is the intent of the college and the school to make all this material available up through our website. The MAC papers will be the first to go up. We are in the process of arranging for all of Jack's material to arrive here. We will go through the same process we did with the MAC papers. And the idea is that this material is not just a static history. I mean, and I now say this in Jack's memory, the idea behind all of this was to make this information accessible to people. What happened in the mid-'70s in New York, some people will think is its darkest hour. Others will say it was probably its finest hour, because people came together in ways that one didn't see before and has yet to see again. The series that this morning kicks off was an attempt to make the first use of all of that material by bringing together people who had lived through the fiscal crisis and who could extract from all of those events lessons that might be useful for dealing with future times that the city would face a fiscal stress, which is where we are today. Because if you look at municipal finance, you'll find these continuing cycles of boom and bust. It's just the nature of municipal local government. And so it's bittersweet because Jack was to be here this morning. And while he's not here physically, my sense is that Jack is here both in spirit and will always be a major part of the work we do with the collections. One portion of those archives will be the Jack Beagle collection, and it is our intention to keep this as a living memory to what he saw as an important contribution. Having said that, I want to quickly go through and introduce our panel. So I'm going to start. To my immediate left is Herman Medeo, and while I could spend a lot of time doing introductions, let me just quickly cast a short version of this. Herman is here in part because during the fiscal crisis he was in Congress and played an important role in some of the events that unfolded during that period. To his left is Giff Miller. Giff, as you know, is the Speaker of the City Council and one of the two participants this morning who are faced with having to deal with the current fiscal stress, as we call it in academia, that the city has to undergo. And hopefully what will come out of this morning's interchange will be some useful information that helps him and his colleagues figure out how to get us through this without long-lasting negative effects on the city. To his left is Ned Regan, who is here in his role of having been the state controller, having been elected to the state controller's role in 1978, partly after we had come through the darkest hours, but was also, prior to being state controller, the county executive in Erie County. To his left is Howard Rubenstein, who has been a longstanding advisor to many of the mayors. Howard was an advisor to Mayor Beam, and in fact, for those of you, if you get a chance later in room 763, there is copies of the bankruptcy papers that actually got drawn up and signed and were ready to be delivered on the night of October 17th, 1975, and a press conference that Howard was instrumental in writing to explain why the city now went into bankruptcy, because the funding that was scheduled to be put in place by the UFT didn't happen. Well, it turns out it did happen in the middle of the morning, in part because of one of our other panelists. To Howard's left is Billy Thompson, who is our controller, who is the second major city official who is here this morning, in part, again, to try to participate and extract from our experts information that will help him figure out how to get us out of this mess. And to his left is Richard Ravitch, who, as a private businessman, got called on more than once by Governor Carey to come in and try to unravel complicated financing situations. First, he was asked to come in and deal with the UDC default, and then on the October 17th was asked to try to figure out a way to convince Al Shanker to actually come up with $150 million that the UFT had committed and had now decided to not make as part of the financing package that was necessary. And in fact, it was because of Richard's persuasive discussions with Al that the bankruptcy papers were never filed and the press release was never issued. And to his left is Alan Brower, who during this period was in the city's Office of Management and Budget, and since the mid-'70s has been a very close associate of Jack Beagle's and is the vice president of Jack's company, which I've now frozen on.
Right, program planners.
Program planners. And with that, I'm going to turn the panel over to Herman. Herman?
Okay, thank you. Let me get started right away, although I have some comments as we go along. I think the first thing to take up is to, because there's so many people here who are not around, what was the nature of the city's fiscal crisis in the 70s, and what lessons have we learned in solving that crisis that might be applicable to today? And I think I might start with asking Dick Ravitch to explain.
I think there are very fundamental differences between 1975 and today. They are, without detailed elaboration, the following. One, that the major problem in 75 was a frequent maturing of city debt. The city had been borrowing money on a short-term basis, largely based on anticipated tax revenues and revenue payments from other levels of government, and they never quite met the expectations, and consequently the city had to borrow more when there was a shortfall in revenue. They had to borrow more the next time, so the city had a schedule of maturing debt, sometimes more than one a month. And once its credit was questioned because of the growing debt and the diminishing or increasing budget deficit, the city had no ability to go into the market and borrow. And when the banks, though they had participated in the underwriting of those notes and bonds for some period of time while the city was engaged in those dubious practices, the fact of the matter is that they decided, for a lot of reasons, that they could no longer underwrite the notes and bonds of the city of New York. And when I say dubious practices, let me make it clear, I don't think anybody had any fraud in mind. It did not begin with A-Beam. There was a lot of rectitude directed to A-Beam. Unfairly, it started when Mayor Wagner persuaded Governor Rockefeller to get the law changed so that the city could borrow against estimated receipts and revenues rather than only actual realized receipts and revenues. And that's when the process started and was engaged in most intensively during the Lindsay administration. So it was a long practice, and that is not the problem today. We learned in 75 that you don't borrow to cover operating deficits, though Mayor Bloomberg did it once, and understandably, because he came into office with no time to spare, and everybody agreed there should be at least, it was permissible to do that one borrowing a year ago. But that was that lesson learned. The second major difference was that the state was solvent in 1975 and had a balanced budget and had the ability to help the city. And indeed, it took over functions, court functions, education functions, or costs of higher education and costs of the court system. And the state used its influence in many, many ways, including, the most important of all, legislation that enabled new borrowing by providing a security interest in streams of tax revenue that hadn't existed before. The third difference, major difference, is that the banks aren't involved today, and in any shape or form, and they were a major factor in influence, particularly, frankly, Republican legislators, and they had an impact as well in Washington, where you had a Republican administration, and where many of them had good relationships. And though the federal government didn't do very much for the city at that point in time, whatever they did do was done in no small part because the financial community had a vested interest, having been underwriters of these notes and bonds and holding them, a lot of them, in what was to happen subsequently. So I would say, Herman, that those were the major differences. Today, the budget deficit, again, and I have no independent knowledge, I just know what I read in the papers, seems at both the state and the city level to be far greater than, of course, it was in 1975. And whereas the mayors of the same political party as the governor and the president, which was not the case in 75, and there were a lot of politics, perceptual politics, if you will, at that time, I can't say that in the short term one should have any basis for expecting any real help from the federal government. No, I think that's the long-term solution lies with a different approach to revenue sharing and to health care. But just to finish, if I may, one more second, I think that there is a good prospect, absent the kind of fiscal engineering that we concluded was some of dubious merit in 1975, that if we don't engage in that again, we're going to have to face increased taxes and substantial reductions in the level of public services if we're going to have a balanced budget. And the politics are going to be interesting, because if the deficit gets too great, the law that created the Financial Control Board is still in effect, and on at a certain level, and I don't remember the exact amount of the city's budget deficit, the Control Board comes back into play. 100 million. It's 100 million, thank you, sir. And so that could change the politics of this in New York. So it's a story that is beginning to unfold now. There's a very limited value to looking at 1975 as a way of solving it. The solutions then are not going to solve the problems that we have today.
Thank you, Dick. And I'd like to call on Alan Brower to speak about his experiences, but also the experiences of Jack Beagle. I want to say that in today's New York Observer, there's a well-deserved tribute to Jack Beagle, headed by Terry Galway, "A Union Man Saves the City." Now, Jack and I were at one point close allies, another point bitter opponents. So, but I realize that what is said here about Jack is absolutely accurate. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. If I could start with just a disagreement with what Dick said. I think that there are some valuable lessons from 75 that have to be applied to today. But I would also say that there are some substantial differences. One is, if you look at the definition of crisis, it basically says there's an unstable state of affairs. And clearly in 1975, that was the case. As Dick pointed out, we had bankruptcy facing the city then. It's not facing the city now. And clearly you have a leadership in place with Mayor Bloomberg, City Controller Thompson, and Speaker Miller, who have figured out how to provide a set of solution so that bankruptcy is really not the issue today. It's really how do you get through a very difficult fiscal problem. In terms of some of the other differences between 75 and now, one thing that has not been mentioned by anybody really is that one of the things that we're dealing with now is the repercussions of tax cuts and the tax reductions that happened starting in 1995, now annualized at almost $3.5 billion. That's almost 16% of the city's tax base. Secondly, you've had an act of war committed here in this city, and you really haven't had the federal government step up to really take its fair share in terms of what has to be done to help this city. Both the Speaker and the Controller have both pointed out what the feds haven't done, and I think that's a case that clearly has to be made. A third difference is that the city economy back in '75 was really at its bottom point. We had just gone through a almost 6-year period where 16%, and that's a large number, of the city's workforce, and I don't mean just city employees, but its entire workforce had been lost. Here we have now lost in the last year or so about 2%. That's a wide difference. Fourth, obviously, you have a different situation with the state. The state provided over 3 years in 1975 through 78 almost $800 million of aid to the city. If the city were to get that now, obviously we would have a different situation. If I can now turn to some of the lessons learned and also some, I believe, lessons that haven't been learned. One lesson I think that comes out of that period is that you can't solve problems of that magnitude, and I don't believe you could do that today either, if you don't have all of the stakeholders sitting at the same table. At that time, in order to solve all of the city's problems, the real estate industry, the business industry, the banking industry, the city unions, and the city government and the state all really sat around at the same table and tried to figure out not only what was in their self-interest, but what was in the self-interest of the city. I'm not sure you have that same atmosphere now. I think another lesson that was learned was that what will play out in the media is all of the negative news, and that has to be dealt with in a certain way. You could just see what's happening now. What the headlines are basically layoffs, city economy falling apart, and if there is good news, that gets buried probably on page 87. I think a third lesson is that we can't do it all by ourselves. Clearly, there is aid that is required, even from the state, as difficult as it is now in its financial situation, but clearly from the federal government. I think a fourth lesson, and certainly the Controller has helped in this, is that you have to have open books. You have to be able to go to the public market and say, this is what our real deficit is. Two other, I think, lessons that perhaps haven't been learned is that when you deal with the city's workforce, and they played, as everyone knows, a crucial role in solving the '75 fiscal crisis, there has to be an atmosphere which really plays upon a mutual agenda which all parties have. And that is that there has to be a strong city, it has to have effective services, and all of that leads to a fair set of wages and benefits. And you have to have something other than the government saying, this administration saying, either give us productivity, give us concessions, or we lay people off. That really didn't work in '75, and I don't believe will work today. And I think one of the other unlearned lessons is that if you read one of the papers that was provided, that we wrote back in 1980, it talks about problems then that still exist today. That has to do with an unfair education aid. It has to do with this city being the only one picking up Medicaid costs. It has to do with the federal government not providing substantial assistance to cities such as New York. And the fact is, since '75, we really haven't dealt with those problems. And until you deal with some of those substantial problems, we're going to be here in 10 years talking about another set of city fiscal problems. Chairman, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we have Howard Rubenstein, who was very much involved as an advisor to Mayor Beam in getting all the people together, who eventually came up with a solution to the crisis. Howard?
As we led up to the crisis, the public really had no inkling of the depth of our problem. And I had some unusual experiences. I ran the runoff against you, Herman, actually.
Right, yeah.
And Abe...
I'll get to that. I'll get to
We'll
that.
forget that. This is some reunion, I'll tell you. How we ended up as very close friends, I'll never know, but we are. But leading up to that, Abe Beam ran his campaign on the person who knew the buck. Remember that?
Yeah.
He took pride in his former positions. And we did promotions that he was the guy that could lead us out of any wilderness, financial wilderness. Then the storm clouds started, and he was adamant in his position. I went into him, I'll never forget that. I went into him and I said, Abe, every penny I have is in municipal paper, municipal bonds. He said, not to worry, Howard. And he pulls out of his pocket, he had just bought some city paper. And he said, well, the banks will never, never throw us into bankruptcy. Well, I guess he didn't know the buck so well at the time, and the public wasn't really prepared for the storm that was brewing. When it happened, David Rockefeller put a task force together and came up with a brilliant analysis and plan and visited with us at Gracie Mansion. And he warned the mayor, you have to cap increases to the unions, and he came up with some pretty tough medicine. Abe still said, they'll never, never throw us into bankruptcy. It just can't happen. Well, we came to the edge, and I'll never forget the time at Gracie Mansion. It was John Zuccotti and myself and Sid Fergand, and there was another person. We wrote that press release while Ira Milstein got the papers signed throwing the city into bankruptcy, and there were police cars ready all over the place, ready to serve those papers on every bank that would thwart that from happening. It was a terrible crisis. Not too many people knew that behind the scenes, Jack Beagle was in operation. And while the teachers had publicly turned down and meant it, use of their pension funds to pay what our debts were, Jack was negotiating with the other unions, and he kept saying to me, "Don't worry, Howard." And I thought that was an Abe Beam statement, but behind it all,
Jack really meant it.
Jack made the deal where the unions eventually came in and rescued the city. The tension between Governor Carey and Mayor Beam was very intense. There were times when they wouldn't talk to each other. There were times where we met at the Waldorf Astoria at midnight, where they were in different parts of the room, not talking to each other. Jim Kavanaugh was there. He was the deputy mayor who was forced out. He was one of the heads that rolled because the bank said someone had to go. Well, it wasn't going to be the mayor. Jim Kavanaugh had to go. The tension was immense. And David Rockefeller was on the phone waiting for our answer as to whether we would cap union increases to a small percentage. And we came to that agreement. I think the lessons that I learned during that time, we really have to bring all of the elements of New York City together. That's when Lou Rudin stepped to the plate with the Association for a Better New York. 6 of us formed the Association for a Better New York. It started out as the Commercial Properties Association because landlords were raising the rents sky high, and we jawboned landlords, and we said, you do that, you're going to get commercial rent control. Then one big tenant tore up a potential lease, and the decline started, and Abney was formed. And all through that crisis, Lou Rudin and the Abney Group, and Jack Beagle was right in the middle of it, as was Bob Wagner and others, John Lindsay eventually. We reached out to every group in town and helped bring them together. Jack formed a group of bankers and labor people, business leaders. We need that in New York. Right now, I don't see that happening as yet. There are so many disparate moves being made, some selfish, some not selfish, but what I see now that I didn't see then was a coherent effort by all of the forces that ran New York to get together and help government plan something that'll work. We're in a far worse crisis today, publicly, than I've ever seen in 49 years of doing what I do. We also had another advantage. Jimmy Carter was running for president and depended on Abe Beam's endorsement, first big city mayor. And Sid Frigand and I and the mayor met with Jimmy Carter in a rundown hotel. I'll never forget that. And we drove a very hard bargain with him for Abe Beam's endorsement of Jimmy Carter. And that was pretty helpful. When we went to visit Nelson Rockefeller in Washington, seeking his help previously, we didn't have a lot of luck, interestingly enough. We were basically turned down. Ford to City, drop dead, you remember that? The media will count. I think you're going to find that the tabloids are going to be relentless in demanding firings, tremendous cuts in our budget. But I don't see how government can do it without the support of all of the elements that were brought together then. And a number of us have pledged our help to try to do that. And Herman, I love you.
Thank you. Well, as you can gather, I can't just be the moderator here because in the interest of full disclosure, I have to talk about my involvement in this. But first, let me give you an idea of how this crisis affected the local districts, because I was the congressman from the South Bronx. And this is a statement that I had in press release of February 18, 1975, about the capital budget. It pointed out that not one penny is allocated for community boards 1, 2, and 3 in my congressional district. It is incomprehensible, Badillo said, that this budget does not provide for one Best Pocket Park, one school, or one light bulb for the streets. In addition to which, there was one school where the bricks had become separated and the inspectors refused to say that it was sound. There was another school which the fire department had declared hazardous, and there was no money at all to do anything about it. In addition to that, in my district, there was a proposal which came about to close Fordham Hospital and Morrisania Hospital, and another proposal which did not come about to close Ostos Community College. But in exchange for that, another one that angered me more, which was to have tuition imposed at the City University, which I thought was outrageous after about 100 years and more. And during that time, I was, Ed Koch and I had been designated by the congressional delegation to be the spokesman for all the members of Congress. So we watched everything that was going on. And I was the one who wrote the bankruptcy law for New York. Because prior to my involvement in the issue, I was in the Judiciary Committee then, it was impossible for the city to go into bankruptcy, because to go into bankruptcy, you would require the consent of 51% of all the creditors. And nobody knew who the creditors were. So therefore, from a practical point of view, it couldn't happen. So I introduced legislation which was approved overwhelmingly by Congress and signed by the President, which made it possible for the city to go into bankruptcy because the city would be treated like any other enterprise. It didn't have to get consent to the creditors. When that happened, I was violently attacked, but everybody panicked because they realized that bankruptcy could be possible, and as Dick pointed out, a bankruptcy bill, a statement was prepared to go into bankruptcy. That, in my opinion, forced all of the people to get together because it was no longer something they could talk about. It was something that could happen if action did not take place. And that led to the solution. But in addition to what has been indicated by the others, I want to point out one other thing that was helpful. And that was that the governor was Hugh Carey, who had been a member of the Ways and Means Committee in Congress, and a very popular congressman. And the president, he knew President Ford because Ford had been the minority leader of the Republicans in the House. So Hugh Carey worked very hard with the members of Congress and with President Ford to ensure that we got congressional support and support from the president. And this is one of the things that we need to do now. So I think this covers pretty much what was going on. And now I want to turn to Speaker Miller to tell us how does he see the crisis today.
Well, thank you. I think a lot has been said that's been absolutely true about the differences between the crisis of the mid-'70s and today. I think the one point that really hasn't been adequately made about the difference between those crises is, I think, the state of the city now and the state of the city then. I think perhaps in even just a larger sense, a spiritual sense, I think in the mid-'70s there was a concern about whether the city could even really function as a city. How could government work? Could cities work? Was there the potential that you could ever do anything about crime or really make the city in the future a quality place to live and to work? And I think that today we are in a different type of a crisis. It's a more literally fiscal crisis in the sense that we just don't have money in order to afford what we are currently slated to have to afford. But we have extraordinary low crime. We've just come, I think, as Alan said, we've just come off one of the great economic booms of all time, as opposed to being at the latter end of one of the great economic slides of all time. So we're in a very different position. We've come to where we are, to my mind, for three reasons. The first is that we were bombed, and directly as a result of our being the site of the September 11th tragedy, our city has lost, the GAO says $3 billion over the last year and a half. It's probably more than that, just in terms of local revenues, forgetting the actual cost to the city, which the controller has very, very well documented at $95 billion was your estimate, or something, which of course is just an estimate, but I mean it's a useful point of remembering. But for those cities' local revenues, we've lost a huge portion of our local revenues just for being September 11th. The second reason, of course, is the national economic recession, which particularly affects city sections of the economy. And the third reason is that we lived a little too high during the 90s, frankly. We either cut taxes too much or raised spending too much or did a little bit of both. And while some of us made some of those points during the 90s, we clearly did not do it well enough. And we, as a result, I think there are those three factors that bring us to the crisis that we're in right now, which is just simply we don't have enough money. We have a gap projected until the actions that we took a week ago of $6.4 billion for next year, after having closed a $5 billion gap that in the earlier budget that ballooned again and left us with a $1 billion hole in this current budget that we also closed a week ago. So, and basically speaking, I think the healthy thing is that we really do know the size and severity of the gap. Even if people didn't act like it until recently, they're finally acting like it now. And we know that there's only three things that you can do when you're faced with a gap of this size. And then people are only talking about those three things. The first thing is you can borrow some money. And we did some of that this past year, more than perhaps I would have liked, but we did some of it. But I think there's a general recognition that we can't do more of that. I guess there are four things. The second thing you can do is sell things, and we may get to that point. But the more honest thing to do is to figure out how much you can cut in spending, and then figure out a way to make your revenues cover those expenses. And I think that's what we're engaged in the process of. We've cut $3.5 billion out of the budget in the last 12 months, which is no small achievement. Some of those cuts have severely affected services. Others have been just able to be taken and should have been taken probably long ago. We have further to go in that regard. We have to cut more spending. We have to figure out ways to do what we currently do better, and we may have to decide that some of the things that we do, we can't do anymore. Library service, for example, we've gone from 6 days to 5 days. I think we have to hold the line at 5 days, but there's an example. We lost a day of library service. We're going to lose, we lost weekend, or we're losing some meals for seniors, and we're going to continue to lose other types of services that are real, that people expect, and to some extent probably deserve, but we can't afford. And the other alternative is to raise taxes. It's just that simple. And I think that, and that's why we took the step that we took a week ago, because we recognized that there was no way we were going to get out of this problem without raising property taxes. Anybody that thought we were going to get out of this problem without raising property taxes just wasn't paying attention to what the reality of the situation was. And so we did it. But even after we did it, we still have probably for next year about a $3 billion gap, which is a very big gap, and will have to be solved with exactly the same methods. So we have to go back to the drawing board, work with the controller, and I think Howard and other people's point is absolutely right that ultimately we're going to have to take some very difficult measures in order to solve this particular fiscal crisis. That can only work if it builds towards recovery in the future. Because if everything we do is just bad and leads us into a decline, we're never going to solve the problem ultimately, because we'll just keep going into fiscal crisis after fiscal crisis. And we can't keep cutting spending and raising taxes forever, because eventually there aren't enough taxes and there's too much spending. So what we have to do is build towards a recovery, and the way that you build towards recovery is by building confidence in the future of the city of New York, which I have tremendous confidence in, because I think this is still the most extraordinary city in the world, and I can't imagine why anyone would want to live anywhere else. But the way that you build that confidence is by bringing everybody to the table, and by bringing labor and business and communities, and trying to give everybody a sense that the course that we've charted is one that reflects the needs of different communities, is fair to different communities, and ultimately builds for a better future. And I think that actually the council plays a special role in that regard, because of the reality that we're 51 members from 51 different communities across the city, and that we have a better, frankly, working understanding of what's really going on in every community in this city than anyone else can, because just of the nature of who we are. And so we have to play a special role in trying to build that consensus, and trying to build that belief in the future, and trying to build that understanding that the decisions that are being made fairly and wisely, and with due regard to everyone's concerns.
Okay. Controller Thompson, how do you see the crisis, and what do you think could be done that is not being done now?
Well, let me start, and as one who has, I went through the crisis of the 1970s. Definitely not in as prominent a role as all of you, but remember the 1970s. Remember the devastating impact on the city of New York, and how long it took us to recover from those budget reductions. I mean, there's some who will say that it took us until the 1990s to get past those budget cuts. First thing, and as I start, I would like to mention Jack Beagle, just for a second. Jack was just a really great person. Alan, and I've had the benefit of Jack's wisdom, and at times his charm and his sarcastic attitude at times, in being able to meet with him and draw on his knowledge. And I will miss him. And it's funny. Alan had called on Friday to tell me that Jack had passed away. We were all supposed to meet on Monday morning. So I will miss him and his counsel. Going back and looking, no, I think that before you get there, the lessons of the 70s And I think there are those of us now who remember that, but also all of us in government don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 70s. And when I say that, it is the budget reductions that were made, the cuts, the tens of thousands of people who were laid off, and the cuts to quality of service set the city back, and that was the only way that it could be dealt with then, set the city back for decades. We lost the best and brightest. There were people in college who chose never to work for the city of New York or who left New York City, never to come back again. The cuts in quality of service, reductions, and increase of crime that went along with it, as well as just larger deterioration, are things that all of us in government right now are not going to repeat, are not going to go back to, and to help relive that. No, I think the Speaker has pointed out the three reasons, the reasons that got us to this situation, which are once again very different from the mid-1970s. If you look, no one was aware. I mean, as Howard mentioned, A-Beam until the last minute said, geez, everything was fine. We're going to get past this. We're not going to go into bankruptcy. I think we saw this in a number of ways. We saw this coming, or at least half of the fiscal situation that we are in now. The projections for deficit were between $2 and $3 billion prior to September 11th. Obviously, no one could have looked at and predicted September 11th. That's the other half of our problem, and that was something that was clear that no one could see. But that's the other half, half not of our making in the city of New York. So I don't think, just to look at, no, we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the 70s, the massive layoffs, the freezing or basically just suspending a capital budget. I mean, you put off preventative maintenance and construction and development in the city of New York, it did damage for decades. If you look at where we are at now, no, I think that, as far as looking at reducing spending, and no, that is being done, and we have to continue to do more of that. Clearly, tax increases in the short term. If you look, about $3 billion worth of taxes, or $2 to $3 billion worth of taxes, were reduced in the 90s. You are, at this point now, bringing back taxes in some ways to be able to fill that budget gap. It is clear, though, that once you stabilize things, and know we are going to get through this budget year, and you've made a major step towards getting through the next year, clearly then with a little time, things that have to be done is you have to start to look at all your city agencies, at your services, in fact, how you deliver those services. Can you do them differently? Can you reallocate dollars in different directions? That has to be done. And right now, as we deal in the short term with our budget problems, all of us haven't done that in a huge way. That clearly has to be done. Looking back at the 70s, differences also. And no, there were a lot of political divisions back then. You don't see those same political divisions now. I mean, the Speaker and the Speaker and City Hall and the Comptroller's Office talk on a regular basis. We all understand that we are in a fiscal situation that we have to get out of. And in one form or another, everybody puts their political ego on the side to be able to get out of that situation. So there are a number of, if you look at the size and the magnitude of the problems in the 1970s and now, no, those are similar, at least the size and the magnitude of the problems. The solutions, I think, are different than the 1970s. You are on the verge of bankruptcy. We are not going to go bankrupt. We will do, and some of the controls put in place because of the 70s, the transparency in city budget won't allow us to get in that position now. You can see the problem coming well in advance and start to deal with it in a number of different ways. So there are similarities between the 1970s, but at the same point, I think there are vast differences between now and the mid-1970s.
Ned Regan, you were the controller of the state of New York for many years, and you are familiar with the state budget and with the problems that the state of New York has today. And as you heard from some of the speakers, one of the proposed solutions is getting more help from the state or being able to change formulas, such as the Medicaid formula. How do you see those things as a possibility for solving the crisis?
Herman, right on point. I don't know if this is on or not, but you're right on point. And you've got to remember, though, that in the 70s, Hugh Carey could round up votes, upstate senators, upstate assembly people, because he could say to them, that we put controls on the city, controls on spending. There is such a thing called MAC that will do the borrowing. There is a financial control board. There is the special office of state controller that had far more power over the city budget than they did the state budget, and exercised that power all the time, giving cover in many ways, Bill, to the drastic actions that had to be taken. If a controller says we ought to do this and do that, and then a mayor and a governor can kind of come in behind and with a little bit of a political cover. So what happened then was that Hugh Carey and his counterpart, whose name has not been mentioned, Bill Proxmire, in the Senate. Everybody, all us graybeards here, when we hear the word Proxmire, we all kind of tremble. But he was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee and insisted on a set of controls and disciplines for the city, just like Hugh Carey did, insisted on it for the city. What's the political purpose here? Well, what's the political benefit? That meant that when Warren Anderson, the majority leader of the state Senate, had to collect votes from the senator from Utica, New York, or Rome, New York, or wherever, or Syracuse, New York, or Mineola out on Long Island, and that senator felt that when he or she went to the Rotary Club the next week, they were going to put under pressure. What are you sending money to New York City for, putting it down that big drain hole? And of course, Mr. Miller is right. The difference between, and you use the word spirituality, I think, and you're completely correct. The difference of the feeling outside of New York about New York is totally different than it was 25 years ago. And that means votes, and that means support. But they had to be able, when the state senators and assembly people stood up in front of the local Rotary, they had to be able to say, don't worry, we've got controls on this money, and it's going for a good purpose, and I can give you an accounting. The state controller could do this, and everybody else could do it. I can give you an accounting. The same thing duplicated itself at the federal level. Imagine in the 70s standing up in front of a local chamber of commerce out in the Midwest and explaining why you were guaranteeing bonds. They had to say that they had controls on it, and that the federal taxpayers' money was being spent well. Well, that's the difference. There are no state. The state is not insisting that we do this or do that. The federal government is not insisting that we do this or do that. And while the reputation of New York City out in the hinterlands is far better than it was, we have not either imposed on ourselves or had imposed on us the type of control which would allow a U.S. senator, a member of the House, to stand up in front of his or her local group and say we're aiding New York because we've got ourselves covered because of this, and this. So that hasn't existed. And I think that we miss that. We miss, believe it or not, well, we know we miss Hugh Carey and what he did. I don't mean in the sense of current political leadership, but certainly the actions he took were very, very, very tough when he called Mayor Bean and, in essence, kind of told him there was a fellow named Felix Roth and was going to come and see him. And things started to change rather rapidly. And when Bill Proxmire would come to town, or when he would just start to pronounce, that had a unique effect, and that sort of thing hasn't occurred so far today. Finally, let me just wrap up on what the other point that Mr. Badillo mentioned, that Herman mentioned. Medical assistance. It's called Medicaid. What's on the local property tax budget line for medical assistance? $3 billion? $4 billion?
Medicaid, yeah. Cities.
$4 billion.
3 to 4.
How much is on Chicago's city budget? Zip. Philadelphia, zip. Los Angeles, nothing. Pittsburgh, nothing. Go right across the country. Why does New York City have to take what percent of how much property tax revenues do you raise? Round numbers?
It's about, now it's about 10 billion.
10 billion. Why does New York City have to take 40% of your property taxes for a function that no other city in the United States has to take 5 cents for. And it's a long story. We don't have time for it here. But until somebody unravels and is willing to unravel, is willing to look down the barrel of the gun, as to why us taxpayers in New York City have this function that no other group of taxpayers in any other city in the United States of America has, look down the barrel of the gun and answer this problem. Until that happens, we're going to be overtaxed, period. 40% of the property tax. Where is the blame? All in Albany? No way. Why doesn't Albany pick up more of the Medicaid function like other states, like 49 other states do? I can tell you why. I can tell you one reason why, at least, and that is that New York City's spending historically of medical assistance funds is like no other group spends medical assistance funds in the United States of America. We have a vast middle-class entitlement. Now, if that's what all of us want as influential leaders of the city, to maintain and keep this vast entitlement, well, then I don't see why the senator from Utica is going to say we're going to pick this up. And of course, raising the taxes raising state taxes in Utica to cover it. So we've got to start there, and we've got to look at it if we really want to deal with this problem. And I certainly hope we do. That's a vast difference between now and where we were 25 years ago.
Thanks. Dick Kravitz had some point, and then
Before Dick goes, and there's just one quick comment
Sure.
that I'd like to throw in. In listening to everyone, and as you talk about the problems of the 70s compared to the differences of the problems right now, I mean, the entire conversation has been a lot about what the state and the federal government did. Difference right now, I haven't seen the state or the federal government assist New York City in a large way. We have been largely left on our own. And the comment has come back in so many different ways, you're on your own. So, you know, that is a huge difference.
yeah, but we fought for it then. That's the difference.
No,
remember?
it's not a question of fighting for it.
I know we in Congress, and as I mentioned, Hugh Carey, we were spending a lot of time working on the Congressman Proxmire and the president.
Absolutely.
So it was a very organized campaign.
At the same point, as I said, and I seem to remember both the president saying he would stand with New York City after September 11th, as well as everyone else, and in so many different ways, we are still waiting for that help and that assistance.
I think it's a little bit complicated by the September 11th. It is complicated by September 11th because of the confusion, I think, in the public's mind, and maybe to some extent, I don't know if the word is confusion, but perhaps willingness to allow there to be confusion on the part of a lot of people in Washington over the $21.5 billion, which is for the purpose of rebuilding Lower Manhattan, which isn't enough to rebuild Lower Manhattan, but certainly is a lot of money and for which we're appreciative, but which doesn't help our problem on the short-term fiscal sense whatsoever. And so the problem is complicated by this sort of desire to say, well, thank you for the $21.5 billion, and not look too ungrateful for the $21.5 billion, but a recognition that the $21.5 billion is just not even close to what we need. And I think what Ned said is very true about Medicaid and the problems of the city really come a lot from the fact that we're forced or asked or choose to do things that other localities don't do or aren't asked to do. And we send billions, as Senator Moynihan always point out, we send billions and billions of dollars to Washington that we don't get back. We send billions of dollars to Albany that we don't get back. And yet Albany and Washington feel like we're wasting all of their money, which is extraordinarily unfortunate. But in this particular case, we're really complicated by the September 11th problem, in the sense that it is sort of it's helpful in that the country to some degree wants to rally around us, but also hurtful in the sense that they felt like they already did rally around us, and why are they having to rally around us again?
Kravitz, go ahead.
I think there is perhaps a little confusion. You'll forgive me, Ned. I don't think it is accurate to say that Albany doesn't have the power to decide what the Medicaid formula is. They can decide all eligibility by state for Medicaid by state statute. So the city of New York has no power to decide that independently of what the legislature does. And there are many historical reasons why in New York City the local share is divided between the city and the state, whereas in most other jurisdictions, as you point out, it's not. But there are many historic reasons. It has to do with state revenue sharing formulas, school aid formulas, etc. But it is not because of profligacy in New York City standards. Those are set by the New York State Legislature. Sure, we have higher costs here in the city of New York for many reasons that have little to do with politics, but everything costs more in New York City than it does in most areas upstate. That's just a fact of life. But let me say what I think is most important to put in perspective. Dealing with other levels of government with rectitude gets you absolutely nowhere. It may make everybody feel good, but it doesn't get you any support. And it isn't as if Washington or Albany are monolithic, and if you understand legislative politics, you have to appreciate how complicated it is to put together the votes to get something done. And if you're talking seriously, as I did a lot in 1975 with members of Congress about New York, they had a right to express concern about the wages we paid and the revenues we collected and the level of services that we provide. They didn't have free higher education in their states. None of them did. And they said, why should my taxpayers pay for your higher education? That's a legitimate question. We may not like to hear it, but these are legitimate questions for people in other jurisdictions to ask. And Ned is quite right that Hugh Carey's relationships with the Congress had a lot to do with ultimately forging some help. But let's understand what the federal government did in 1975 and 76 was very minimal. They helped refinance $2.5 billion of the city's mortgage debt portfolio under the Menschelama program, all of which was in default, but that had no budgetary impact whatsoever on the federal government. And they ultimately provided limited guarantees for a certain amount of city debt. But there were no massive appropriations or significant payments by the federal government to assist the city in its budget, in its budgetary deficit problems whatsoever. The state did far more than the federal government to avert bankruptcy at that time. But I want to point out what is very different today, and that is I believe there are 37 states in this union that have budget deficits. There are over $60 billion of budget deficit projected in 2003 for the states, and I haven't seen figures on what it is for municipal governments. That's very different. New York was somewhat alone in 1975. Not that everybody wasn't hurting because of the recession, but nobody had been borrowing money that they had no business borrowing for 10 years, like the city of New York had been doing, and nobody faced the severity of that problem. So you have an immense problem that's shared in other jurisdictions. You also have dwindling sales tax revenues around the country because of an ever-increasing percentage of goods that are sold via the internet, which escape the imposition of local sales tax, which is hurting states fiscally in the West. Would never dream of being sympathetic to New York's fiscal problems, but they're having their own. California has a much bigger deficit than New York does. Plus, if you want to think a bit about the fact that there's a paradox that the federal government is reducing taxes while state and local governments are increasing taxes to meet their problems. And it's doubly a paradox because, of course, for those people who itemize their deductions, federal government loses additional revenue when a person pays more state and local taxes because it is a deduction for federal income tax purposes. So now think about the question in a different way, I think is the only way you can approach it, and that is which of the services that government provides to the people of the United States are best provided by state government, local government, or the federal government, and who should pay for them? Don't answer that question just on the basis of what serves our short-term budget interest, but that's how collectively people are going to address this question. Is health care a national obligation, or is it something that should, as it has historically been since the mid-'60s when we got Medicaid, shared equally between the federal and state governments? That's an interesting question. Those of us who believe in some kind of national health care system to deal with the fact that we have over 50 million people in the United States who have no health insurance believe that maybe it ought to be a federal responsibility. If it was, as Herman or Ned pointed out, you look at the numbers, and that alone would close the city's budget gap. If you look at revenue sharing, which hasn't been examined seriously in the 70s, maybe given the sales tax differential, maybe the use of the internet in commerce today is so profound, has such profound implications, that maybe what we ought to consider is a national sales tax, like a VAT, like the countries in Europe have, and a distribution of that in some form of revenue sharing scheme to state and local governments.
Well, the problem is somebody has to introduce that legislation in Congress, and I don't see that coming. Alan Brewer, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
I'd just like to go back to this federal role. You know, in 1975, I don't think there was an argument that was made that people really said that the problems that happened here was our fault. Now, it may have been right, it may have been wrong, but people thought that everything that happened here was as a result of the policies that happened in New York City. If you look at what the controller put out, and forget whether the numbers are precise or not, from a budgetary standpoint, we've lost $3 billion, I think the number is, Bill, on the revenue side. Now, $3 billion would solve next year's budget gap. And again, if you look at the federal government, just think about it for 1 second. If the Eiffel Tower was bombed, or if London Towers was bombed, would their federal government simply say, here's money for redevelopment and then close its doors? I really don't think so. And I think the failure that has happened to date is really twofold. One is that there hasn't been, as Howard said, a coalition of people, of the powers in this city, put together to go down to Washington and make an effective case yet. And I think that's a substantial problem that has to be overcome. And the city is in part, I think, looking for that leadership to come forward and say, let's put together that group, because you can't do it on your own. And that, if there was anything that is missing today, and I think all of us have said that, it is that piece that brought together all of the different parts. I know the speaker has a program out that would involve other cities, because they have problems as well. But there has to be a group put together, perhaps by some of the people here, that says, look, our problem is also your problem, and we need your help in solving that problem.
Okay, let's go to the audience. Would you come up to the microphone and ask questions? Because we got around 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'd like to just ask a question of the panel. One of the mechanisms, we often hear about the mechanisms that were put in place in '75 and the dire consequences of a deficit. One of the mechanisms, however, MAC, which handles a lot of bond financing for the city, raises an interesting issue. We're at historic lows in interest rates. Most individuals are refinancing their mortgages in order to improve their cash flow. Has any thought been given to refinancing some of the MAC bonds and using whatever freed up cash from the secured sales tax revenues that are now captured at the state to pay those bonds as a cash flow source?
Controller Thompson?
Yeah, I think you're about at this point almost out of MAC as far as MAC bonds. I think there's another in the city's budget about $500 million that's left, and once that is paid off, you're out of that. Has there been thought given to refinancing that debt? I mean, one of the things you're trying not to do is to incur additional side door debt. I think the city has gone out and refinanced most of its own outstanding debt, whether it's TFA or whether it's general obligation debt. That was one of the things that Washington did for us, was to give us another round of refinancing at lower levels. So not really. I mean, is it still there? Yes, it is, but you're basically almost paid all of that off, and I don't think you really want to incur additional debt and go back and float additional MAC debt right now.
Go ahead.
There's somebody can answer that question, the executive director of MAC. But I'm sorry, Herman, but let me.
No, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
What is the status with MAC right now?
Has $2.5 billion outstanding.
Still?
The annual debt service over the next 6 years through 08 is $500 million.
So it's okay. So Stan, your question appears.
To have some relevance.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, Dave Seeley, City University of New York, but at the time of the fiscal crisis, I was head of the Public Education Association, and my question, I guess mostly to Mr. Miller, whose leadership I've greatly admired in the last weeks, but it came from a frustration of that time, and it goes back to something that Controller Thompson had to say, that the lessons of 75 not only were what we did that we should apply now, but from the things we failed to do in 75 that we ought to do more of now. And the big thing, it seems to me, we failed to do, certainly in my field of education, was to figure out a way to make schools more effective, even while we had to cut back services. As Mr. Thompson said, and I'm sure he was thinking about education, among other things, the service cuts in education 75 were devastating, absolutely devastating. Nobody understands when you go to budgeting what happens when you pull money away from schools in the middle of the year and keep pulling it away all through the year, and the whole school is in turmoil all through the year. Absolutely devastating, and it lasted, I'd say still lasts today. We're still suffering from those cuts. We're going to have to do some cuts. What we failed to do in 75, and the reason I'm asking Mr. Miller, I'm a little concerned about the framework that you said. There are only three things we can do, as I understood you saying, is borrow money, make cuts, or raise taxes. And it seems to me the fourth category that you sort of hinted about, we have got to use more imagination in figuring out how we can get not just the services, but the things that the services are intended to achieve, namely in the case of schools learning, whether it be clean streets or whatever, ways in which we can mobilize the other resources of this city to help get those things done in ways that we have not done in education. I was commissioned by the economist for the Citibank to do an article in the City Almanac, which came out as productivity in the city schools. There may be better ideas at this time, but the point is we just played with some of those ideas. We need a whole other forum to talk about what can be done, certainly in our field, but in others. I say, how can we mobilize? How can we get this mayor? And I do think and hope that this new chancellor is coming up with some exciting ideas, but he's going to need the help of all the rest of you. And if our framework is only cut services, raise taxes, or borrow money, we're leaving out one of the key things we all have to put our imaginations to.
Well, I think that's a good point. The framework that I said was cut spending, not cut services. And I think part of the notion of cutting spending is precisely in finding ways to, the best way to cut spending is to find ways to do what we want to do more effectively for less dollars. And that includes absolutely productivity savings. And in fact, the council has fought very hard for a number of productivity savings that we've actually accomplished in just the last year. We have been, for many years, fighting for civilianizing in the police department, which can save us money and improve public safety, and in fact was adopted in this year's budget and saved several $100 million, I think. Another point was when we merged the Department of EMS and the fire department. It was a good, response time went down. But amazingly, we were sending out $160 million worth of bills for EMS services and getting paid about $26 million because we did it so poorly. And the council said, well, let's privatize the billing service. And in fact, the fire department is doing that, and we're hoping that we can end up getting something between 60 and 80 million, at least $60 to $80 million more in payments. And I think the same thing holds true in every agency. We have to be looking at ways to change our notion of what it is that we do it more effectively. Council actually is called, and I still don't know why this hasn't happened. We should eliminate the mayor's office of contracts. We should consolidate some agencies, and we need to look through the school's budget and every part of the budget to come up with ways to be more productive and and use our dollars more wisely and more effectively in order to accomplish more with them. I don't view that as a separate thing. I think that's critical to cutting spending. We should be doing it in good times, by the way, as well as in bad. In fact, some of those points we argued about through the 90s about trying to accomplish, but especially in tough times. When you're looking at whether to reduce services or increase taxes, you should start by looking at how to deliver services more efficiently, and we're certainly trying to do that.
I'd like to quickly say it's not just efficiency. It's getting more of what you need to get done, not just more of the
I
services.
just want you to know that a team from the City University will be in this on this campus for 3 hours and another 2 hours, and information technology kinds of savings. We expect to get out of that maybe annualized to $500,000 a year. They've already been at the community colleges, and they're working very hard to deliver services more efficiently for less taxpayer dollars. So it's happening in the education field.
Doug, go ahead.
Doug Musio from the School of Public Affairs here at Baruch. One observation and an historical question. There is one absolutely crucial difference between the crisis of the mid-'70s and the '90s and today, and there's one player that hasn't really been discussed except in the past, and that is we've got players out there who are consciously attempting to destroy the New York City economy. The major difference is that the bombing that the speaker talks about, we are constantly living under that threat. Now, this is clearly an uncontrolled variable, but not to sound like Cassandra or for a nightmare scenario, right now 2 suicide bombers blow themselves up at Grand Central Station. All of this, while we must do it and act as if it's not going to happen, I think analytically we've got to recognize that the game itself is totally different because there's this external player out there trying to ruin the game. The second is an historical question that goes to Mr. Rubenstein and President Reagan, and that is there were rumors at the time that the governor had intended to remove Mayor Beam from the mayoralty, and I wish you could comment on that.
Howard?
Well, I'm not a mind reader about his intention. Well,
I can I'm sorry, Howard, I can answer that.
But, I might be able to answer that, but I won't. I'll turn it over to you.
I will tell you. I will tell you all.
I know how to say no comment from time to time.
No, I think it's very interesting because I will tell you that there were a number of the major business leaders in New York and the banks and newspaper editors and prominent journalists and communications with the governor who urged him to hold the kind of hearing that existed. And I was a participant in some of the discussions, and Hugh Carey said there ain't no way that I would ever consider doing that because Abe Beam did not do anything that was morally wrong or illegal or anything like that, and I'm not going to even consider it. And he ruled it out, but there is no question that as I said earlier, the amount of rectitude that was directed to Abe Beam was, and I won't speculate as to all the motives for it, but it was so grossly excessive and inappropriate in so many cases. But despite the fact, as Howard said, that their relationship was bad for a lot of reasons, Hugh Carey never considered for a second removing Abe Beam. That's an answer to your question.
Right. Alan?
Yeah, I just want to get back to I think the first part of that comment, which is not as sexy as to whether a mayor is going to be removed or not, but maybe is more important to this city now. And I think the speaker talked about this in terms of the spirit of New York City. I mean, if you step back now about 15 months after what happened on 9/11, and you think of the devastation that happened then and the crisis that we all felt as New Yorkers, and you think about where we are now, it's a remarkable story, not only about this city, its government, but its people. And I think the message that the speaker said is something that really has to be sent all out in this world, that we have recovered and overcome a devastating attack. And not only will we survive this fiscal problem, because clearly bankruptcy is not here, this city will come out of it stronger as a result of that.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Evan Kingsley from Brooklyn Public Library, and Speaker Miller, I particularly appreciate your statement about library service and its continuity. One of the trends that I think has been important since 1975 is the growth in the role of the private sector in providing certain public services or helping to facilitate the provision of public services. You think about business improvement districts, you think about the role of the New York City Partnership in the school system, you look at the Newmans, the Fields, the Weissmans, and the Zicklins and their role in helping to make Baruch College a stronger institution, of course, at Brooklyn Public Library, and the other libraries, the role of foundations. This is a trend that's been both very helpful and also has some consequences as well. And I wonder if anybody would address the kind of future of this trend. Will the role of the private sector in providing services formerly provided exclusively by government, will that trend continue? And how do you assure the private sector that in so doing, they're not essentially replacing government's essential responsibility?
Ned, you want to do that? Because you have some experience here at Baruch.
Could you sharpen that, though, a teeny bit?
Well, there's some concern on the part of I think, of people in the private sector that their role in supporting public services formerly provided by the city they'll ultimately be seen as replacing those services rather than supplementing.
That's true. The answer to that is, yes, your premise is accurate in the sense that people do see that. And I suppose when we raise money from the people you've just mentioned and others, when we raise money, we have to deal with that problem all the time. And the BIDs the bids are the classic example. People through assessment pay for services that the city presumably at one point provided. There's just an awful lot of that going on. I think that most New Yorkers, most Americans expect that there's going to be more and more charitable donations, philanthropic activity in an area that government once took over. More and more do you see foundations, what's the phrase of nonprofit agencies functioning almost side by side with government. This is just a very vast trend. And the accounting, though, is pretty easy. We can show pretty much and have an arrangement with CUNY that, and the state that we can demonstrate to a potential donor that in the past, as money has come in, it has been put on top and nobody came around and took something out of our back pocket at the time.
I think, if I could just...
Sure.
I think that just briefly, because I know there are a couple other questions, and I'm sure the panelists like I have to run in a minute, but I think one of the big challenges in terms of seeing private philanthropic support is for government to make sure that we don't just allow this to sort of help the more popular type programs and then see the less popular but equally as important programs suffer as a result. So, private sector ends up picking up parks in nice neighborhoods and where there's lots of rich donors around, and doesn't help parks in neighborhoods where there aren't a lot of rich donors that live around it. Or we end up paying, or the private sector ends up helping in the schools, but nobody's going to pay for the jails. There's a responsibility the government has to make sure that that philanthropic support is done in a way that supplements everybody and not just supplements the few. And I think that's a major challenge. Although I'm not sure, how how it, in the context of our fiscal crisis, you know, we need to take money from wherever we can get it. So if there are any philanthropic donors out there,
We'll take the check.
Bill and I have numbers which Bill.
So I want to thank the panel for the specific and great contributions. I turn it back to Stan.
Before you leave, I just want to, as I mentioned earlier, thank you. There are 2 future panels. January 22nd, we're having a panel of prior budget directors that go back as far as the Lindsay administration to offer their insights of what they had to deal with. And on February 6th, we're bringing members of the various legislative delegations of the city to talk about the role that the 3 levels of government play. And all of this series are being dedicated to Jack Beagle's active involvement in all of this. And so I personally want to thank you for coming, and my thanks to the panel. Thank you. If you go to 763 around the corner, you'll see samples of what's in the archives.
Oh, I know that.